Imagine this. You're standing in a field of brittle, sun-bleached grass. You can't even see the earth beneath your boots because it's hidden under bodies. The air isn't just hot, it's heavy. It presses into your chest with every breath. The temperature has climbed past 40 degrees Celsius, and it feels like the sky itself is leaning down on you. But the heat? That's not even the worst part. It's the smoke. Thick, oily smoke rolling in from brush fires deliberately set by an enemy who understands exactly what you need and exactly what you don't have. You're wrapped in 30 kilograms of chainmail and padding, and your armor has turned into a furnace. Sweat pours down your skin but does nothing to cool you. Your tongue is swollen, dry, and foreign in your mouth. You haven't tasted water in over 24 hours. Around you, the pride of European chivalry, knights who believed they were chosen by God, men who thought themselves invincible, are collapsing without a single sword touching them. They're dying of thirst. This isn't some medieval horror story invented centuries later. This is July 4th, 1187, the Battle of Hattin. It was the day the most powerful army in Christendom didn't just lose. It was methodically dismantled by heat, pride, and one of the most capable commanders of the Middle Ages. How does an army built to conquer the world end up suffocating and dehydrating on a hill in Galilee? Before we step into that smoke-filled nightmare, let's pull back and understand how it all unraveled. Because Hattin didn't begin on the battlefield. It began in a council chamber. In 1187, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem looked impressive on a map. To someone sitting comfortably in London or Paris, it probably seemed permanent. A victorious Christian foothold in the Holy Land, established during the First Crusade almost a century earlier. But the truth was far more fragile. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was essentially a colonial state surrounded by enemies. A narrow strip of land hugging the Mediterranean coast, stretching from modern-day Lebanon down toward the Sinai. It had strong castles. It had formidable knights. What it didn't have was strategic depth. There was nowhere to retreat. If the army fell, the kingdom fell with it. For decades, the Crusaders survived because their enemies were divided. Muslim cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo were often too busy fighting each other to focus on the Franks. The Christians exploited that division brilliantly. But by the late 12th century, that balance was shifting. The fractures in the Islamic world were healing, stitched together by a rising leader we'll meet soon. And inside Jerusalem itself, the cracks were already spreading. For years, the kingdom had been held together by the iron will of King Baldwin IV, known to history as Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. He was a tragic figure, a young king suffering from leprosy, his body slowly failing him, yet his mind sharp and disciplined. Baldwin understood something crucial. Survival required balance. Peace wasn't weakness. It was necessity. He kept ambitious nobles in check. He maintained fragile truces with Muslim powers. He knew the kingdom was living on borrowed time. But in 1185, Baldwin died, and with him went the kingdom's stabilizing force. The crown passed to his sister Sibylla, and through her, to her husband, Guy of Lusignan. This is where the story turns dark. Guy looked like a king. He had the charm, the noble lineage, the confidence, but he lacked something far more important: strength of character. He was indecisive, easily influenced, desperate for approval. And at the worst possible moment, Jerusalem needed steel. The court quickly fractured into two hostile factions. On one side stood the native barons, men like Raymond III of Tripoli. These were nobles born in the Holy Land. They spoke Arabic. They understood the climate, the politics, the brutal reality of Levantine summers. They knew that water was more precious than gold. They advocated caution, defensive strategy, diplomacy. They were realists. On the other side were the militant hardliners, newcomers from Europe and the powerful military orders, especially the Templars and Hospitallers. Their leader was the fiery Grand Master Gérard de Riedfort, along with the volatile Lord Raynald of Châtillon. These men saw compromise as cowardice. They believed God guaranteed victory. Terrain didn't matter. Logistics didn't matter. Thirst didn't matter. A righteous cavalry charge could smash any enemy. They were idealists. And in the desert, idealism can kill you. The tension between these factions was toxic. They distrusted each other almost as much as they distrusted their Muslim neighbors. While the cautious faction tried to preserve fragile peace, Raynald of Châtillon actively worked to destroy it. From his fortress of Kerak, perched strategically above vital trade routes linking Egypt and Syria, Raynald ruled like a rogue warlord. He didn't care about treaties. He cared about plunder, and the kingdom's weak king couldn't control him. That was the real poison in Jerusalem's veins: a divided court, a powerless monarch, and a powerful enemy gathering strength just beyond the horizon. The disaster of Hattin didn't begin with a grand declaration of war. It began with provocation. Because if the kingdom of Jerusalem was a powder keg, Raynald of Châtillon was the man sprinting toward it with a lit torch, laughing as he ran. To understand the catastrophe that followed, you have to understand Raynald. History remembers him as reckless, greedy, violent, a man who broke oaths as easily as other men breathed. And honestly, that reputation isn't exaggerated, but he was also a symptom of something bigger: the total breakdown of central authority inside the Crusader states. Raynald had arrived in the Holy Land with nothing: no wealth, no power, just ambition sharp enough to cut steel. Through marriage and maneuvering, he became Lord of Ultra-Jourdain, a vast territory east of the Jordan River. His seat of power was the towering fortress of Kerak. If you glance at a map, you immediately see the problem. Kerak sat directly above the King's Highway, the lifeline trade route connecting Damascus to Cairo. Every caravan carrying spices, silk, gold, and pilgrims passed beneath Raynald's walls. For Muslim merchants, riding past Kerak was like tiptoeing past a sleeping dragon. By 1187, there was a truce in place between Jerusalem and the rising Muslim power under Saladin. It allowed trade to flow. Pilgrims traveled safely. It stabilized the region. It benefited everyone, except Raynald. Peace didn't fill his coffers. Peace didn't satisfy his ego. So when a massive caravan traveled from Cairo to Damascus, wealthy, guarded, and possibly including members of Saladin's own family, Raynald saw opportunity. He attacked. His men slaughtered the escort, seized the goods, and dragged the survivors to his dungeons. When reminded of the truce, Raynald reportedly sneered, "Let your Muhammad come and save you." It was more than a raid. It was a calculated insult. When word reached Saladin in Damascus, the reaction was volcanic. Saladin was a man who valued honor and oaths. To him, this wasn't just piracy. It was a personal affront, a violation of sacred trust. He swore that if he ever captured Raynald of Châtillon, he would kill him with his own hands. That vow would matter. Saladin sent envoys to King Guy, demanding restitution. The prisoners returned, the goods restored, compensation paid. A strong king would have forced compliance. Guy did not. He ordered Raynald to make things right. Raynald simply refused. In his lands, he said, he answered to no one, and just like that, the illusion shattered. The king of Jerusalem couldn't control his own vassal. The truce died not with a bang, but with paralysis. Hardliners like Gerard de Riedfort applauded Raynald's defiance. They insisted that war was inevitable anyway. Better to show strength now than appease a Muslim ruler. They whispered in Guy's ear, feeding his insecurities, reminded him that his crown rested on fragile support. If he punished Raynald, he risked alienating powerful allies. Terrified of losing legitimacy, Guy did nothing. Saladin had his answer. If the Christians could not control their own lords, then their word meant nothing. He began calling for jihad. Messengers rode from Damascus to Aleppo, Mosul, and Cairo. The message was simple and powerful. The Franks had broken the peace, murdered pilgrims, and insulted the prophet. Raynald had handed Saladin the greatest gift a leader can receive: a just cause. For years, Saladin had worked tirelessly to unify the Muslim world. Born a Kurd, rising through talent rather than noble blood, he had methodically consolidated power across Egypt and Syria. He wasn't just a battlefield commander. He was a political architect. By 1187, he had completed something extraordinary. Egypt and Syria were united under his rule. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer wedged between rival Muslim states. It was surrounded. On a map, the Crusader kingdom looked like a small island in a vast sea of Ayyubid green, and now that sea was rising. Saladin mobilized on a scale unseen in decades. He emptied treasuries to hire mercenaries, constructed siege engines, summoned tribal levies and professional cavalry. His army was disciplined and flexible. The elite Mamluks could match European knights in close combat. His light cavalry, swift horse archers, specialized in harassment and attrition. They didn't need to win a glorious charge. They needed to exhaust you. They needed to cut off your water. Saladin understood something his enemies did not. In the Levant, the environment is a weapon. He moved his forces toward the Golan Heights, threatening multiple Crusader strongholds at once. The initiative was his. He could strike Tiberias, Acre, or Sephoria, so he chose carefully. He attacked Tiberias. It wasn't random. Tiberias belonged to the wife of Raymond of Tripoli, the cautious noble who had consistently argued for restraint. Saladin wasn't just attacking a town. He was attacking pride. By July 2nd, 1187, the largest army the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever assembled gathered at the springs of Sephoria. More than 20,000 men, around 1,200 heavily armored knights, infantry, mercenaries, the white mantles of the Templars, the black cloaks of the Hospitallers. At the center stood the true cross, encased in gold, believed to be the very wood upon which Christ had died. It was a symbol of invincibility. But the real battle wasn't outside. It was inside the king's red tent. To reach Tiberias, the army would have to march roughly 15 miles across arid plateau in the height of summer. No shade, no reliable water. Raymond of Tripoli, whose own wife was inside the besieged city, stood before the council and made a speech that could have saved the kingdom. "Let it fall," he said. "Better to lose one city than the entire army. Stay at Sephoria. Let Saladin come to them. Force him to suffer from heat and supply shortages instead." It was brutally logical, and at first, it worked. The council agreed. Even King Guy accepted the advice. The army would hold position. The kingdom, for a moment, was safe. But that night, Gerard de Riedfort entered the king's tent. He poisoned the air with doubt. He accused Raymond of treachery, claimed staying put would brand Guy a coward. reminded him that his legitimacy depended on the support of men like the Templars. Guy was terrified of being seen as weak, and under flickering lamplight, he reversed the decision. Before dawn on July the 3rd, the trumpets sounded. The order spread through the camp. "We march for Tiberias." When Raymond heard, he reportedly whispered, "We are dead men. The kingdom is finished." And with that, the army left the cool, life-giving springs of Sephoria behind. They marched toward the furnace. At first, the march looked magnificent. A glittering river of steel stretched for miles across the Galilean hills. Banners snapped in the wind. Priests sang psalms. The knights rode in disciplined formation, sunlight flashing off polished mail. But within hours, the sun began its real work. The distance from Sephoria to Tiberias was only about 15 miles. On a mild day, it would have been manageable. But this wasn't a mild day. It was high summer in the Levant. The temperature surged past 35 degrees Celsius, and there was no shade. Then the enemy appeared, not in neat ranks offering battle. That's what the Crusaders wanted, a decisive clash of heavy cavalry. Instead, Saladin's light horse archers swarmed the flanks like hornets. They galloped close, loosed volleys of arrows, and wheeled away before the knights could even lower their lances. They weren't aiming for armored chests. They were aiming for horses. When a knight's mount collapsed, he became slow, vulnerable, a walking furnace wrapped in steel. As horses fell, the column slowed. The march became a crawl. Dust rose in suffocating clouds, turning the air into grit. It coated throats, burned eyes, and mixed with sweat into a choking paste. Inside their armor, the heat was unbearable. A knight wore padded gambeson beneath chainmail, sometimes topped with a surcoat. It was like wearing winter clothing inside a sauna. Sweat soaked the padding, which chafed raw skin. Water skins emptied fast, and there was no water ahead. By midday, disaster loomed. The Sea of Galilee shimmered in the distance like a mirage. They had covered barely half the distance. Scouts brought grim news. Saladin's main force blocked the road to Tiberias. They couldn't reach the lake. Raymond of Tripoli sent a desperate message to the king. Divert to the springs of Hattin, a smaller water source nearby. It was their last chance. But Saladin anticipated it. Muslim forces blocked the path. The Crusaders were herded onto the arid plateau of Lubaya, surrounded, no water, exhausted. King Guy ordered the tents pitched. When Raymond saw the royal red tent rising on that dry hill, he cried out, "The kingdom is lost." Night fell, but night brought no relief. The Crusader army, nearly 20,000 strong, huddled in darkness, completely encircled. From the surrounding hills came drums, cymbals, and thousands of voices chanting Allahu Akbar. It was psychological warfare, a reminder they were trapped. But the thirst was worse. They had gone more than 24 hours without water in extreme heat. Tongues swelled, blood thickened, men staggered in delirium. Some broke open wine supplies, desperate for moisture, only to worsen dehydration. Others licked dew from rocks or clawed at dry earth, praying for a hidden spring. From the Muslim lines, observers watched with cold clarity. Among them was Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, who described the Crusaders as withering plants, panting like dogs. Saladin escalated the torment. He ordered brushwood piled upwind and set ablaze. Smoke rolled into the Christian camp, stinging eyes and filling parched lungs. They coughed and gagged through the night. Inside the royal tent, silence reigned. At dawn on July 4th, a hot eastern wind began to blow, directly into the Crusader lines. Saladin saw opportunity. He ordered fires lit across the plain. A wall of flame and smoke advanced. Through the haze came arrows, thousands. Horses screamed, men fell. The air roared with fire and bowstrings. Then discipline snapped. The infantry, choking and delirious, broke ranks and scrambled up the slopes of the Horns of Hattin, twin volcanic peaks towering above the battlefield. King Guy begged them to return. Their reported reply, "We are dying of thirst." Without infantry support, the knights were exposed. Medieval warfare relied on synergy, foot soldiers shielding cavalry. Now the heavy horse stood alone. Saladin's Mamluks charged. The Templars and Hospitallers fought ferociously, launching desperate countercharges. At one moment, they even pushed Muslim lines back. Watching from a distance, Saladin tugged nervously at his beard. But these were dying spasms. Horses collapsed. Knights crashed into dust and rose as slow-moving targets. Surrounded, harried, suffocating, they were driven higher up the slopes. Somewhere in the chaos, Raymond of Tripoli gathered his remaining knights and charged through a weak point. Muslim forces parted, allowing him to escape. The battle was already won. By afternoon, the Crusaders were compressed around the king's red tent, and at the center stood the true cross. To modern eyes, it's just wood. But to these men, it was divine guarantee. As long as it stood, God had not abandoned them. The Bishop of Acre held it aloft until he collapsed from heat. The Bishop of Lydda lifted it next. Around them, knights formed a last wall of steel. On a nearby rise stood Saladin and his young son Al-Afdal. The boy cheered prematurely as Crusader lines wavered. Saladin silenced him. "We have not beaten them until that tent falls." Fresh waves attacked. Finally, the last defenders broke. The bishops were overwhelmed. The true cross was seized. The ropes of the red tent were cut. It collapsed into dust. Saladin dismounted, prostrated himself, and wept in gratitude. For the Crusaders, it was spiritual annihilation. Men dropped swords and fell to their knees. King Guy and Raynald of Châtillon were captured alive. That evening, inside Saladin's pavilion, judgment came. An iced drink was brought to Guy. He drank greedily. In Islamic custom, offering drink meant protection. When Guy passed it to Raynald, Saladin clarified, "It is the king who gives him drink, not I." Saladin reminded Raynald of his crimes. Unrepentant, Raynald shrugged them off. Saladin drew his blade and struck him down, fulfilling his vow. Guy trembled, but was spared. Outside, around 200 captured Templars and Hospitallers were executed. Saladin considered them irredeemable fanatics. The army of Jerusalem was gone. The road to the Holy City lay open. In the weeks that followed, cities fell like dominoes. Acre, Jaffa, Ascalon. By September, Saladin stood before Jerusalem itself. The defense, led by Balian of Ibelin, was brave but hopeless. When the city surrendered, Saladin did not massacre its inhabitants, as the Crusaders had done in 1099. Ransoms were arranged. Many were enslaved, but there was no wholesale slaughter. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem returned to Muslim control. The cross atop the dome of the rock was taken down. The call to prayer rang out again. So what does Hattin teach us? The Crusaders had superior armor, fierce cavalry, and religious zeal. But they ignored geography. They ignored logistics. They believed faith exempted them from reality. It didn't. Saladin won not only through tactics, but through patience. He weaponized the sun, the dust, and the wind. In the desert, nature is sovereign. The disaster sent shockwaves across Europe and sparked the Third Crusade. bringing figures like Richard I of England east to challenge Saladin. But that is another story. For years, bones whitened on the horns of Hattin, a silent warning. Arrogance is heavy armor, and it offers no protection against the truth.